A Vermont Romance by Clara Winslow. The crisp October air nipped at Sarah's cheeks as she hiked along the winding trail, her boots crunching rhythmically on the carpet of fallen leaves. Maples, oaks, and birches towered above her, their branches adorned with a breathtaking tapestry of crimson, gold, and burnished orange. She paused at a clearing, drinking in the vista of rolling hills that stretched before her, ablaze with the vibrant hues of fall. Sarah Collins had come to Vermont, seeking solace and a fresh start. At 32, she was still reeling from a painful divorce and the relentless stress of her high-pressure job as a corporate lawyer in Boston, when she stumbled across an advertisement for a month-long writer's retreat in a quaint Vermont town. It felt like a lifeline thrown to a drowning woman. Without giving herself time to second-guess the decision, she'd taken a leave of absence from her firm and packed her bags. Now, 2 weeks into her stay, Sarah felt a sense of peace she hadn't experienced in years. The retreat was everything she'd hoped for and more. She'd settled into a cozy routine of morning hikes, afternoons spent writing at local cafes, and quiet evenings curled up with a book by the fireplace in her rented cabin. The simple pleasures of small-town life were a balm to her frayed nerves, and she found herself smiling more often than not, a marked change from the perpetual frown she'd worn in Boston. As Sarah rounded a bend in the trail, lost in contemplation of her next chapter, she nearly collided with a tall, broad-shouldered man coming from the opposite direction. "Look out there," he exclaimed, reaching out to steady her. "You okay?" Sarah looked up, momentarily flustered. The man had kind eyes the color of warm honey and an easy smile that made her heart skip a beat. His rugged good looks were accentuated by a neatly trimmed beard and windswept hair the color of roasted chestnuts. "I'm fine, thanks," she managed, tucking a stray lock of hair behind her ear. "Just got lost in the scenery, I guess." He chuckled, a rich, warm sound that seemed to resonate with the autumn air around them. "It has that effect on people. I'm Jack, by the way. Jack Hawkins." "Sarah Collins," she replied, shaking his outstretched hand. His grip was firm and calloused, clearly a man who worked with his hands. The brief contact sent a tiny shiver up her arm, which she attributed to the cool air. "You're not from around here, are you, Sarah?" Jack asked, his eyes twinkling with amusement. She shook her head, a wry smile playing on her lips. "That obvious, huh? I'm staying at Maple Grove for a writing retreat." "Ah, another city slicker come to find inspiration in our little slice of paradise," he teased good-naturedly. "Well, you picked a perfect time of year for it. The foliage is at its peak right now." They fell into step together, chatting easily as they continued along the trail. Sarah learned that Jack was a local woodworker who specialized in custom furniture. He'd grown up in the area and knew these trails like the back of his hand. As they walked, Jack pointed out various plants and wildlife, sharing tidbits about the local ecosystem. Sarah found herself captivated by his knowledge and the obvious passion he had for this land. As they neared the end of the trail, Sarah found herself reluctant for their encounter to end. Jack seemed to share the sentiment. "You know," he said, a hint of hesitation in his voice, "if you're interested in seeing more of the area, I'd be happy to show you around. There are some lesser-known spots that are really spectacular this time of year." Sarah hesitated. She'd come here to focus on her writing, not to get involved with anyone. But there was something about Jack's easygoing nature that put her at ease, and if she was honest with herself, the prospect of spending more time with this intriguing man was undeniably appealing. "That sounds great," she found herself saying. "I'd love to see more of Vermont." They made plans to meet the following afternoon, and Sarah headed back to her cabin with a spring in her step she hadn't felt in months. As she walked, a red-tailed hawk soared overhead, its cry echoing through the valley. Sarah smiled, feeling as free as that bird for the first time in years. Over the next week, Sarah and Jack explored the area together. He took her on scenic drives through winding country roads, where every turn revealed a new postcard-worthy vista. They visited a local apple orchard, laughing as they picked sun-warmed fruit straight from the trees. Jack introduced her to his favorite local haunts, a cozy bookstore with creaking wooden floors and the aroma of fresh coffee, a family-owned diner that served the best blueberry pancakes Sarah had ever tasted, and a hidden waterfall that tumbled over moss-covered rocks into a crystal-clear pool below. One crisp afternoon, Jack even convinced Sarah to try her hand at fly fishing in a picturesque mountain stream. She was hopeless at it, tangling her line more often than not, but Jack's patient instruction and playful teasing made it one of the most enjoyable afternoons she'd had in years. As they spent time together, Sarah found herself opening up to Jack in a way she hadn't with anyone in a long time. She told him about her divorce, her struggles with burnout, and her dreams of becoming a novelist. Jack listened without judgment, offering words of encouragement and sharing his own experiences of overcoming setbacks. "I wasn't always a woodworker, you know," he confided one evening as they sat on the porch of his workshop, watching the sun set behind the mountains. "I used to work in finance in New York City. Thought I had it all. The corner office, the expensive suits, the fancy restaurants. But I was miserable." Sarah nodded, understanding all too well. "What changed?" Jack's eyes took on a faraway look. "My dad got sick. Pancreatic cancer. I came back here to help take care of him, and in those final months I rediscovered the things that really mattered. The peace of these mountains, the satisfaction of creating something with your own hands, the simple joy of a life well lived." He turned to her, his gaze intense. "After Dad passed, I couldn't bring myself to go back to that life in New York. So I stayed. I learned woodworking from an old friend of my father's, and never looked back." Sarah felt a lump form in her throat. "I'm so sorry about your dad," she said softly. "But I'm glad you found your way here. You seem at peace." Jack reached out and squeezed her hand gently. "I am. And I'm glad it led me to cross paths with you, Sarah Collins." The warmth of his touch lingered long after he'd let go, leaving Sarah's heart fluttering with a mixture of excitement and trepidation. As the days passed, Sarah found her novel taking shape, infused with the beauty and spirit of Vermont that she'd fallen in love with. Her protagonist, once a thinly veiled version of herself, began to take on a life of her own, embarking on a journey of self-discovery amid the Green Mountains. But it wasn't just her writing that was flourishing. With each day spent in Jack's company, Sarah felt the walls around her heart beginning to crumble. His kindness, his passion for life, and his quiet strength were a balm to her wounded spirit. She found herself looking forward to their time together with an eagerness that both thrilled and terrified her. One particularly golden afternoon, Jack took her to a secluded overlook he claimed was his favorite spot in all of Vermont. They hiked for over an hour, the trail growing steeper and more challenging as they ascended. Just when Sarah thought her legs couldn't take another step, they emerged onto a rocky outcropping that took her breath away. Before them stretched a panoramic view of the valley below, a patchwork quilt of farmland and forest painted in the rich hues of autumn. The late afternoon sun bathed everything in a warm, honeyed glow, and a gentle breeze carried the scent of pine and wood smoke. "Oh, Jack," Sarah breathed, awestruck. "It's beautiful." He smiled, pleasure evident in his eyes as he watched her reaction. "It gets better," he said, reaching into his backpack. With a flourish, he produced a thermos of hot apple cider and 2 enamel mugs. They settled on a fallen log, sipping the spiced cider and drinking in the view. Sarah felt a warmth that had nothing to do with the beverage spreading through her chest. Jack turned to her, his expression suddenly serious. "Sarah, I have to admit something. I've really enjoyed spending time with you these past couple of weeks. I know you're only here temporarily, but I can't help feeling like there's something special between us." Sarah's heart raced. She'd been fighting her growing attraction to Jack, telling herself it was just a fleeting vacation romance. But hearing him voice his feelings made her realize she felt the same way. "I felt it too," she admitted softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "But Jack, I live in Boston. My whole life is there. And you're so rooted here in Vermont. I don't see how this could work long term." Jack reached out and took her hand, his touch sending sparks through her. "I understand. But Sarah, sometimes you have to take a leap of faith. I'm not asking for any promises. I'm just asking if you're willing to see where this might lead." Sarah looked into his earnest eyes, seeing in them a future she'd never dared to imagine for herself. A life filled with purpose, passion, and love. Slowly, she leaned in and kissed him softly. It was a kiss full of promise and possibility, sweet as the cider they'd shared and warm as the fading sunlight that bathed them in its glow. As they made their way back down the trail, hand in hand, Sarah's mind raced with both excitement and trepidation. She had come to Vermont seeking inspiration for her writing, but she might have found something even more valuable, a second chance at love. The remaining 2 weeks of Sarah's retreat flew by in a whirlwind of stolen moments with Jack and furious writing sessions. Her novel was taking shape, the pages filled with vivid descriptions of Vermont's natural beauty and characters who felt as real to her as the people she'd met in this small town. All too soon it was time for Sarah to return to Boston. As Jack drove her to the airport, an uncomfortable silence hung between them, heavy with unspoken words and suppressed emotions. "So, what happens now?" Sarah finally asked as they pulled into the departure's lane, her voice small and uncertain. Jack turned off the engine and faced her, his eyes filled with a mixture of sadness and determination. "That's up to you, Sarah. I meant what I said before. I think we have something special, and I'm willing to try and make this work if you are." Sarah's heart ached at the thought of leaving him. In just a month, Jack had become such an integral part of her life. The thought of returning to her lonely apartment and high-stress job in Boston filled her with a sense of dread. But she also knew she had responsibilities, her career, her family, her whole life was back in the city. "I need some time to think," she said, fighting back tears. "This has all happened so fast, and I don't want to make any rash decisions." Jack nodded, understanding in his eyes. "Take all the time you need. I'll be here." They shared one last, lingering kiss before Sarah grabbed her bags and headed into the terminal. As she boarded her flight, she felt torn between the life she was returning to and the possibility of a new one she was leaving behind. Back in Boston, Sarah threw herself into her work, trying to ignore the Jack-shaped hole in her heart. She finished her novel, drawing on the emotions of her Vermont experience to bring depth to her characters. Her literary agent was thrilled with the manuscript, praising its authenticity and heart. But as the weeks passed, Sarah found herself increasingly dissatisfied with her old life. The long hours at the law firm felt more draining than ever. The constant noise and bustle of the city grated on her nerves. She missed the peace and connection to nature she'd found in Vermont. And most of all, she missed Jack. They spoke on the phone regularly, their conversations a lifeline that Sarah clung to. But it wasn't the same as being with him, seeing his smile, feeling the warmth of his hand in hers. One particularly stressful day at work, Sarah found herself staring out her office window at the gray Boston skyline. The trees lining the street below were bare, their leaves long since fallen. She thought of the glorious autumn she'd experienced in Vermont, of the way the whole world had seemed alive with color and possibility. Suddenly, everything became clear. She knew what she had to do. Sarah marched into her boss's office and handed in her resignation. She called her landlord and gave notice on her apartment. Then, heart pounding with equal parts terror and exhilaration, she booked a one-way ticket to Vermont. Jack was waiting for her at the small regional airport, a look of disbelief and joy on his face as she walked through the arrival gates. "Sarah, what are you doing here?" She dropped her bags and threw her arms around him. "Taking a leap of faith," she said, before pulling him in for a passionate kiss. As they drove back to town, Sarah explained her decision. "I realized that what I found here in Vermont, the peace, the inspiration, and most importantly, you, that's what I want my life to be about. I don't know exactly how this is going to work, but I want to figure it out together." Jack squeezed her hand, his eyes shining with emotion. "We'll figure it out day by day. Welcome home, Sarah." As they crested a hill, the town came into view, nestled in a valley painted with the muted tones of early winter. A light dusting of snow covered the ground, glittering in the weak sunlight. It wasn't the blazing autumn landscape Sarah had left behind, but it was beautiful in its own way, a blank canvas full of possibility. Sarah felt a sense of rightness settle over her. She didn't know what challenges lay ahead, but she knew that with Jack by her side and the beauty of Vermont surrounding her, she was exactly where she was meant to be. That evening, as they sat by the fireplace in Jack's cozy living room, Sarah raised her mug of hot cocoa in a toast. "To taking leaps of faith," she said, her eyes shining with love and hope for the future. Jack clinked his mug against hers, his smile warm and full of promise, and to finding home in unexpected places. As they looked out the window at the star-filled Vermont sky, Sarah knew that her greatest adventure was just beginning. Whatever twists and turns lay ahead, she and Jack would face them together, their love as enduring as the ancient mountains that surrounded them.